You said it's beginning to change. I would go as far as to say it has completely changed. So if there is, and sadly, if there is a bit of a silver lining, it is that the world has woken up to the hypocrisy, the slack that we who had been colonized before had given the West, that, okay, we in a new era, post-colonial, we're all working together. We understand your liberal agenda. You're going to work with us. Oh yeah, you went to war here and there, but you told us it's about spreading democracy, freedom, etc. Oh yeah, we believe that. I think it's clear now. And as I said, if there is a silver lining in this, it is that the world has woken up.
Hello, everybody. This is Pascal from Neutrality Studies, and today I'm talking to Chandran Nair, a Malaysian businessman and scholar. He's the founder of the Global Institute for Tomorrow, an independent think tank based in Hong Kong and Kuala Lumpur. Chandran, welcome to the channel.
Thank you, Pascal. Pleasure to be with you.
Great having you, because you're on several ones of my mailing lists, or your analysis is one of those that reaches me through several channels. And I thought we maybe start with just a little bit about how you approach geopolitics, because you actually work with it, right, on a professional level. You also have a consulting business, and you work with clients who depend on understanding what is actually happening and who are not that interested in the general media framing that, especially in the West at the moment, is at an insane level. But can you maybe give us an outline of how you approach geopolitics?
Well, my interest in geopolitics, as you called it, is framed through the lens of equity and development. And my understanding, to keep it simple, is that current geopolitics is framed by the sort of the empires of the past and the imperialist sort of powers of the past and the hegemonic powers of today, like the USA, etc., trying to cling on to their privileges, which have been essentially accumulated over the last 500 years of European colonization. I mean, we have to remember that Europe essentially colonized North America, and then later the United States, Canada, then there's Australia, etc., New Zealand. And today's geopolitics, as we can see it, is, to put it crudely, is a tension between a small part of the world called the so-called West. It's not a term I coined. It's coined by the Western media, whenever they want to say, oh my God, we need to be careful about these others. But these others are actually 85% of the world. And so we have a tension right now between the hegemonic colonial empires of the past trying to retain their power. And so I see it as that. And what I'm interested in is how those geopolitical tensions, which I frame as wanting to retain old power, is affecting and creating wars, destabilization in very many countries that do not allow them to prosper. So tariffs is a type of war, kind of almost the last stand of the Americans to essentially destabilize the world and retain what they think is the right, America first. So that's how I see it. I'm more interested in, therefore, how does Indonesia, with a population of 280 million, perhaps reaching 350 million, over the next 50 years, develop, and how is the geopolitics of what I described going to impede that? And what we need is a geopolitics that doesn't impede that. How will India, with the world's largest population in a landmass that is a third of China, and with climate change and existential threats, navigate this future if you have a United States now saying, well, you're not the good guy, or Europe saying you're buying Russian energy, therefore we need to do this to you? How does that work? And how does Africa, where the most arable land in the world, develop and become even a food basket first for themselves and throw away the shackles of colonial institutions, etc., which still impose so much on African nations and their development? And finally, I'm interested in geopolitics from the point of view of decolonizing the minds of those who were colonized. And I've written a book about this, about decolonizing the minds of the elites in our part of the world, who are totally confused because they've been brought up to believe that there is a world order, and that world order is simply Western based. And I believe they are behind the times. And we're not saying to replace the West or displace it, to create a geopolitical order in which there's equity, but where 15% of the world do not dictate to the rest of the 85, who are not perfect, by the way, how the world should look like.
This is a very good and useful framing. It's also interesting that you're saying, geopolitics basically as what the West does in order to impede the development of others, and how to navigate that. The Richard Sakwa, Professor Sakwa, he doesn't use the term collective West, but he uses political West in order to describe the number of countries that generally have been collaborating at least since the end of the Second World War, most of them since before, and that of course are all former colonial powers, most of them one way or another, primary or secondary. Switzerland, a tertiary colonial enterprise. But how do you see this now moving? Because geopolitics, we could also understand it in the sense of just how the planet, how world politics moves. And we have seen quite fundamental shifts in the way that the global South is now able to say, like, no, guys, just no.
Yeah, so what is happening, and if you look at particularly the rise of the current U.S. administration, I don't like to name the leader of the current administration in the U.S. because that gives oxygen to just the name. But you have to understand that the sort of almost the right wing, dare I say, almost fascist nature of the current administration of the USA, these people didn't come to power through a military coup. These people came to power because a large amount of Americans put them there. They're emboldened because they have a great amount of power. But what is interesting, and you as a European, though based in Japan, would understand is, what is interesting to the rest of the world is to watch how this balance is now be shifting in the nature of European allegiance to the Americans, right? So for a lot of the world, the rest of the world, I mean, I think I can speak from Asia's point of view. We all were colonized. 95% of Asia was colonized, except perhaps Thailand, right? In some way or shape.
Bhutan.
And Bhutan. And so we understand that many of us are still subservient, the majority, because capture of the mind is deep if after 4 centuries. But we began to understand that Europe understood the empire is over. And Europe began to, understand it needs to be a player. I think it miscalculated by simply joining the Americans in going against China. But that going against China was simply economic fear for the first time in 400 years. A non-Caucasian civilization looked at the West and said, hello, I'm here. And then use what I think is xenophobia, racism, etc. And let's face it, colonization was all about race as well. I describe this in my book about dismantling global white privilege, and it's about economic power. I mean, that's what apartheid was in South Africa as well. So we thought the Europeans understood, but as soon as they found an ally in their most important sort of member of that group of European colonies, etc., the United States, which became so powerful, both economically and militarily, to say, hey, these are the enemies, we can still retain our power, they followed the Americans. Whether it be wars in Middle East, sanctions against this country, they all cling together. So if you open the rest of the world, be it Africa, Latin America, it says, hey, and can I use the word, these white nations always come together. What drives them together? It's a tribal thing about, and what's the tribe? What's the bond? It's colonization. We are superior. We control the resources of the world, which is what I spoke about, what colonization is about. And therefore, we cannot allow that privilege to be eroded in any way. It's deep in the psyche. And then there's other reasons that allow them to morally justify, the heathens, the primitive people. We need to bring religion and civilization to them. So Europe, in my view, many people here believe that Europe, with its long civilizational traditions, etc., would transform. But it didn't. And I'll end by saying one just needs to look at how current European leaders, including the leader of NATO, who calls the president of the United States daddy in front of a global audience and is revered, reveres him. And recently, as the current president of the United States goes to Gaza and talks about peace, which we can talk about later, you see the UK president, the UK prime minister, standing beside him sheepishly, and at one point even mocked by the president, and then coming forward like a little boy. So you see a new imperial order in which, for the West, in which the United States essentially dictates to Europe, which should know better, and should not be rearming as they are. I mean, if 10 years ago you told me that the European Union would abandon its project, which is all about peace, and rearm, and the Europeans would allow the Germans to essentially arm in the way, and the Germans themselves will rearm and be proud of it and have a leader who is so devoted now to, we are a military power, we're going to do all of this, we'd have thought, no, it's not going to happen. And when I discuss this with my German friends, I detect a shift. They also believe we should become a military power.
Yeah.
10 years ago, none of them would have been subscribed to this. So I think this is important, Pullman, to discuss how Europe has become completely a satellite sort of coalition of nations to the United States arrogance and military ambitions.
I'm very glad that you're putting it into these very clear terms. That's exactly how I see it too. And part of the job is to explain how that happened, how this vassalization and this utter subordination, not only of the actual institutions, but also of large parts of the mind, actually happened, which is ironic because that's what the Europeans did with the world that they colonized. And now they're being counter-colonized and subdued and used as a tool. And we see how Ukraine is already the spear tip of this colonized part of Europe, right? And just one thing, like I wonder, when because you know these people for a while, because you've also interacted with them in the Club of Rome, you interact with them in the World Economic Forum. Maybe first, the concept of colonization, one must understand. The Europeans misunderstand colonialism in a really bizarre way. To most Europeans, colonialism is something like feudalism. We all know it was there, we know it was bad, but we stopped it millions of years ago. So it stopped, it's part of the distant past. So why would any reasonable person, today's enlightened, forward-looking, inclusive Europe and North America, where you have, blacks and whites and Asians and, a mix of cultures. How can you describe that as colonial? Can you maybe clean that up a little bit for us?
Well, it's a simple term for it is denial. Very few of us want to accept our past, especially if it's mired in colonization, crimes, genocide, exploitation. We don't want to. And then we say, but that was in the past. And that's good if we can then say no more. And this is why, for until about a year and a half ago, I go to Europe a lot. I have many European friends. I have friends from all around the world. I always respected Germany a great deal because I thought the Germans are teaching the world that if you commit a crime, you stand up and say, we did this and we are sorry. And I think the Germans did this in an exemplary way with regard to the Holocaust. Yeah. But they abandon all of that now when it comes to Gaza. So I think there's something deep in the European psyche that had a performative sort of element in terms of saying, we did some things, but that was so long ago. It's all done. But in fact, it was okay to say because they were comfortable in the knowledge we still control the world, right? We still control Africa. I mean, those who are interested can go and look at how even African currencies and all of that. And then they start to say that, China is the new threat. Those who are really in the can go and research all of this. So they do that, especially in Francophone Africa, the French presence in terms of oversight even in terms of the monetary policies and all of that, is French, right? So they do that. And then there's the soft colonization, which is what it's in my parts of the world, etc. It's still about, if you're if you're a British Empire, is the Anglo-Saxon education system, is the financial systems, all of that. I talk about that in my book, in terms of dismantling global white privilege, that it's essentially woven into the entire fabric of the post-colonial era. It's all the institutions of the world. It's the financial architecture. It's education, and even down to how you talk and speak in English, etc. So Europeans and so-called liberal Americans were very happy to say that's all in the past, and we all wanted to believe that. Of course, we all want to believe. We want to say, okay, that was in the past. Let's move on. And I think the awakening in this part, at least for people like me, for a long time has been, that is superficial. That's why I wrote the book, right? Superficial. But I'll tell you that what Gaza has done is stripped away any sense of others in the world saying, actually, they meant what they were trying to say, that they were building a new liberal order. And what Gaza has done is stripped away the notion that there was a transformation that had taken place, particularly in the West, that was willing to say we will partner with the rest of the world. We may have certain differences. What Gaza has unfortunately done is said, you thought we had changed, but we haven't. We're still the same, because we need to essentially protect the rights of a small minority called Westerners who had colonized many parts of the world. If the troops were no more on the ground, we at least have the architecture to do that. And in Gaza, we saw the most brutal side of essentially the last stand of a white settler community saying, we will not in any way give up our rights to land that has been colonized and is ours, and it was supported. And the ideology of white supremacy resurfaced in ways that were the most brutal and essentially manifested in a genocide. The world has woken up. And until a few months ago, most European nations dare not even say that this is a genocide, as you know, right? Until today, the Americans, the French, the British have not said it's a genocide. Right. So I think this is the unpacking that has taken place, and the rest of the world has woken up to this. The question for Europe and the United States, when this all settles down, and it cannot erase the genocide despite all the fanfare about the peace. Of course, the killing hopefully has stopped, but that was a genocide. The question is, will those who committed this crime essentially be put on trial like the Nuremberg trial? And will the world witness essentially the reckoning? If it doesn't, and it's likely it will not happen, then the world will say, okay, this changed everything. And that there is no ability in the global institutions to take to task and essentially put the West on the stand and ask them to essentially say, we pay for these crimes. And it's the same old thing, you win, you write the rules. And if you don't win, you just don't write the rules. So, Germany paid a high price because it lost, but the winner was the West. And in this instance, if Gaza, a war crime, genocide has been committed, who are the winners here? And the peacemakers, apparently the same people who committed the genocide. So they're not going to then start to take their own institutions to court, or call it the Hague, etc. So this is the complete sort of convulsion consciousness that is I think splitting many in the West. And I think it's something I've written about, that people will in Europe and the USA will not be able to live this down over the next 20, 30 years. If you're a 30-year-old today, European and American, and you have not come out against the genocide, your children will be asking you in 20 years, hey, mommy, daddy, what did you guys do? Because this will go down as the genocide of the 21st century. That is not to say there are not other terrible things happening in the world, right? But it is an excuse that this is the last stand of a white settler community saying, we are number one and we will do everything to retain our power.
In a sense, it's a moment also of great clarity, isn't it? Like about the trajectory of things. Because if you think about it, the 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 genocide on the North American natives is talked away basically as a flu, right? And unfortunate, but it happened. The other genocides also on the, let's say, on the Australian continent are not really part of the global consciousness anymore. They are part now of the footer, the email footer in certain university emails. It's like, I recognize the tribal lands, blah blah blah, which to me is the last and final stage of genocide when you cleanse yourself of the guilt of the past. But as we go forward, we then had the Cold War, during which you already had a good part of the slowly decolonized world that actually said, we don't want to be part of this. We have our own non-aligned movement, and it had its ups and downs. And you could then go forward into the unipolar moment, during which really there's this sense of impunity on the Western side, leading to bombing of Serbia, to the invasion of Iraq, to the bombing and dismantling of Libya, of Syria. I mean, the entire West Asia. But there was always this veil of humanitarianism over it, including like the responsibility to protect, the ability, the power to frame the global discourse in a very, very Western-centric narrative and self-serving narrative. And that one, to me, seems to have slipped away. I mean, for good, with Gaza, with the genocide. How do you see this progression of, like, crimes against humanity, and how they're just harder and harder to hide?
Yeah, I mean, one needs to, because we are talking about this moment and the crime of putting it in Gaza and putting it in context, for your viewers, I want to just be clear. I'm not saying that other terrible things haven't happened in other societies, but I have said, and it's in the book as well, but in terms of duration, scale, intensity of violence, nothing matches the scale of European-led conquest around the world, going back to Latin America, from the Incas right through then to, as you said, Native Americans, etc. Right? Nothing compares. And we see it again, the Second World War and all of that, the wars in Vietnam. No countries in the world have done this on this scale. The last 70 years has been led by the United States, supported by the Europeans. We've seen that from Hiroshima, Nagasaki, a war crime by any standard, all, as you said, just, footnotes now in terms of those were bad people. So to your point, I think this denial has been, they call it history, because our story has not been written. I call it, there is our story and there is his story. This version, not mine.
Uh,
I think his.
like white man's his story. Yeah.
We would call it her story too, so to be gender neutral. But it's not our story. So if you read, there's very few books written by the victims of 400 years of colonization that describe all of this. There are few that many would know. And even those been written by Europeans and Americans. So what's happening now is people in this part of the world, Africa, etc., are writing their books, but they don't make the bestseller lists because the New York Times is not interested in this. Occasionally, they'll put a few things out. So what has happened is that the Gaza events and what's happened to China, what the conflict with the tensions in China has really opened the world to, my God, these guys have not changed. And I put it in the simple terms. So to answer your question, I belong to a few international organizations. And yes, you can imagine, these international organizations are typically dominated by Europeans and Americans, which tell you something again, 15% of the world, but they dominate this discourse. They dominate the narratives too, because people like us are meant to be subservient.
And we're talking now about organizations like the World Economic Forum, right? This kind of type.
All of them, right? They're dominated. So when Gaza appears, there are a few people like me And you have to understand that many, even Asian elites and African elites, do not yet have the confidence to speak about these things and are subservient. So Asian elites, particularly business leaders, etc., have such subservient, they may be extremely wealthy, but they can be punished if you go against the narrative. So I've said that, many Asian elites, political, academic, and business, are essentially subservient and seek association and the privileges associated with those associations with Western institutions. You graduate from Harvard, you're not going to call it the flat earth society. You're not going to use all of this because you lap it up. And even subconsciously, some are conscious, it's a calculated move because I get punished, but others are deeply entrenched. But many Westerners don't understand how that subservience takes place. It's complete colonization of the mind, and I describe it in my book. So what happens then is Western elites think, well, they all support us. So coming back to the associations I belong in with Gaza, I was one of the few Asians who's willing to speak up. I know elite Asians, commentators, who will not write about this because their paycheck, speaking engagements, etc., is associated, the bigger paychecks associated with Western institutions. No one wants to hear you talk about this at a financial conference. I do, and I've written about it. But this has created great discomfort in the associations I belong in, where Europeans and Americans have invariably kept quiet. Elites, well-known personalities, I will not name them, because they are either scared or they do have that fear that and support somehow this notion that the Gaza genocide is not a genocide because of this, and this. And that famous question then, do you support Hamas? The question that's meant to kill every discussion, right? So they are completely conflicted and don't know. So to your point, I was just this week in an exchange in a group, and I said the point you said. The Gaza conflict is not something that I feel I need to essentially follow a narrative that Europeans are so scared of, that the moment you criticize Israel and the Zionists and the evangelical base in the United States that, believes in the return of Jesus and all of that sort of things, that are anti-Semite. I remind them, I come from Asia. My parents were born in colonial Britain. Deprivations of the colonial reign took them to different parts of the world. I'm not saying India was perfect, but India did not decline, and there are many books written about it now, in the way that colonization basically plundered the nation. So I'm Asian. As far as I know, my history, our history, not his story. Asians did not kill 6 million Jews. Europeans did. So don't call me an anti-Semite. It's water off a duck's back. You cannot bully me with that trope. But the Europeans have all been bullied by this. The moment you say to a European or an American, you're an anti-Semite, everyone runs for cover. You can't do that to me. And then I made the point that the Holocaust was one of the worst crimes, but it is one of several committed over 300-400 years across the world. Native Americans dismissed as flu. Very few people know how many Native Americans were killed. It's very interesting. You don't know those numbers. But you have to do research. But, talk about the amount of people killed in China at such and such a time, and they can take it down to the, 2 decimal points, the amount of people killed. Or, you want to talk about Rwanda, and something happened 200 years ago in India. They got all the numbers. But when you talk about, the genocide in North America, Australia, no numbers, nothing's done. So I mentioned that as bad as the Holocaust is, This was just one of a series of crimes committed on a large scale by Europeans against the others or a minority who threatened whatever they were seeking to do in terms of dominating resources or in terms of dominating economies. And this created a great fuss in the discussions I'm having with people.
What I completely agree with you. And I will ask you now about what this then does to the current development in the global south and especially in Asia. But before that, just one thing, it's even worse in a sense to me, because what this traditional Western colonial mindset and colonizing mindset did is it took the weight of this the abhorrent Holocaust against the Jews of Europe, took it and turned it around like a judo move and used it in order to justify the next one. Because that is now the single point of integration where the supporters of the Gaza genocide all rally around saying, like, look, those brown Middle Easterners, West Asians, who got their land stolen from them, robbed from them, and suppressed for 100 years, those are the Nazis. And we are anti-Nazi, therefore we are against it. So it's like it's very sick. It's a really sick twist, but it keeps the mental space of the genocide committing part of the planet clean. Not only clean, it makes it actually a virtue. And I think this though is becoming more and more obvious to the onlookers, right? Who now say, like, look, we've experienced this kind of brutality and cruelty, the surviving part of the globe, right? That survived colonialism, because there's the part that didn't. Again, North and South America and Australia would physically look different. I mean, people's features would be different today, physically different, the way that you and I are physically different, was it not for the successful genocide against them. Now, the survivors, now, is it changing though? Because you're saying that there's the mind is still to a good part colonized in the global south. Where is that standing today?
So I think, as you said, it's beginning to change. I would go as far as to say it has completely changed. So if there is, and sadly, if there is a bit of a silver lining, it is that the world has woken up to the hypocrisy, the slack that we who had been colonized before had given the West. That, okay, we in a new era, post-colonial, we're all working together. We understand your liberal agenda. You're going to work with us. Oh yeah, you went to war here and there, but you told us it's about spreading democracy, freedom, etc. Oh yeah, we believe that. I think it's clear now, and as I said, if there is a silver lining in this, it is that the world has woken up. I, for one, am very glad that has been, if I can call it, yeah, one of the positive things, if you can even use that word, coming out of this. I sort of tongue in cheek often say that I like Donald Trump, the first time I'll mention him, the President of the United States, because he has done us a service by saying, I'm a white supremacist. My country is essentially one dominated by white supremacist ideology, Democrats and Republicans. We are united when it comes to opposing the world. Anyone who stands up, be it Chinese, be it Palestinians, or be it Venezuelans, we are in charge. And now we got the Europeans also on our side, and we have taken them over. So the rest of the world says, okay, very clear. And that's the good thing he has done. He's taken the mask off, the sort of facade of liberalism, which became so sophisticated, became an industry with all those nice institutions and all of those, agencies that are going out to help poor Asians and Africans. To your point, the Tarzan and Jane savior. We'll go to Africa, we'll speak to the apes. Because they've been there for God knows, since the start of time, since human beings, appeared on the continent. But me, Tarzan and Jane, we know how to speak to the apes, and we will come and save you. And so that mentality now, a lot of Asians believed it because we were brought up watching Tarzan and Jane. We were brought up watching John Wayne, Civilized Joe Upton, and Sitting Bull. We were brought up on all of these things. The good thing about this time is the world has said no more. We understand now. And that has been the only sort of green shoots coming out of the brutality of what we have seen in Gaza, but also what we've seen with the constant war of attrition against any nation that is willing to say we have a different view of how the world should be and our own development. And at this time, in the last 10 years, that only one nation has been able to stand up is China. And I know you talk a lot about China as well. So I think this has been the outcome, and the world has changed. And for people interested, my good friend Pankaj Mishra has written a good book called The World After Gaza. I have written a couple of articles, but there are many others. But few Westerners, intellectuals, have been prepared, except for people like Jeffrey Sachs, etc., who've been outspoken about this. The Western public intellectual has disappeared.
I mean, they're still there. They're not on the airwaves, right? They're on these kind of podcasts because this is the space where you can go.
They have no space. Those who speak up have been essentially marginalized. They can't appear on BBC or CNN
Yeah,
because,
because
right.
you know, the fascinating thing about the era we are going through is that really the the liberalism of this supposedly liberal society is so autocratic that it even manages to get rid of former top people. And just sorry, as a segue, I had on this channel the former military chief of NATO, Harald Kuyat, German, the military leader, not the civilian, the military one, right? And that guy has been very outspoken in saying what we're doing in Europe with Russia is suicidal because look, if we put our troops all the way over there and we ostracize them, blah, 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 then of course there will be war. Of course, naturally. That guy cannot, and he literally told me, I was invited to a TV show. I told them, you understand, I'm persona non grata. Guy said, like, no, it's fine, we want you. He gets a call the same evening saying, like, sorry, it's canceled. It's like, you're actually really persona non grata, that far. And this, this space is so slim. Two things though. How do you evaluate from the this war, this structural war between Russia and the West, or the political West? Is there also a colonial component to it, as you see it? And secondly, how are now the global South countries dealing with that? I mean, you said like people are still afraid and so on, but this will induce change, right? And it must already lead to a rethinking of how to interact with that political West.
Yeah, I mean, I like to say that I don't claim to be an expert on that long history of relationships between Russia and Europe. But I can say that I've been following this for the last 15 years, not just the Ukraine dimension of it, but the whole thing. I can't name the company, but I sat on the global advisory board of a very large German company for about 6, 7 years. 8 years ago, we had a board meeting, and I remember the board chairman saying that rising tension between Europe and Russia will be a complete crisis for Japan for Germany because of energy, and that this is the most ridiculous thing we are doing, and we should find a way to negotiate. I would say that, and it's the timing is interesting. That as long as there were adults in the room, like Angela Merkel, there was somehow dialogue with the Russian side, Putin. But I don't know, can't exactly how many months, but a few months after Angela Merkel stepped down as chancellor, the war broke out because the adults had all left the room, right? So I'm not going to take sides on Russia, etc. But what I do know, to your point, is that most people in the world do not see it the way Europeans see it, that there's evil Russia and there's the good guys in Ukraine. People don't, because as I say in certain things I've written, that we've seen this movie before in the colonized world. We've seen it. The demonization of those people, these are good. We know much of this is lies, that is much more complex in that way, or much more simple. And I think anyone who is objective and looking at the facts will know that the Russians have said for a long time, please do not come closer, right, with NATO. And NATO kept, and I think it's very clear to everyone that NATO is part of the American military industrial complex, which is not something that, 10 years ago, if you talked about the military industrial complex, which now includes media, academia, etc., you would say, this is some sort of lefty, must be from that Che Guevara camp or something like that. And they're not real. Well, today, everyone understands it's real. It's one of the most powerful economic groups in the United States. It controls everything. Many in the House and Senate have essentially vested interests in terms of economic interests in the military industrial complex. They don't need to declare all of those. So the military industrial complex rules as part of the deep state. So what we see is that military industrial complex started to essentially threaten Europe, and it now got its way. I think 5% GDP for military consumption, etc., will go to the military industrial complex. And so the rest of the world looks at this and says, we've seen this movie before. I think no one supports war. No one supports invasion. But everybody understands the context. And it's simply put in this way. If the Russians or the Chinese built military bases in Mexico, or let's take Venezuela, there'd be full-out war led by the United States in Latin America, or in Cuba, as it nearly happened. And so, we understand that. And so people are more neutral, non-aligned on it. But no one goes out and says, not no one, not everyone goes out and says, the Russians made a mistake. And you can see a nation like India, which has been heavily criticized for being neutral and buying Russian oil. And there are many videos, which I'm sure you've seen, where the Indian foreign minister is repeatedly asked in Europe, so when are you going to stop buying? And he says, actually, we buy much less than you guys in Europe. You're fighting them. You're asking me not to buy, but you're actually buying more. And you're all still reliant on this. So I think in this part of the world, it's non-aligned. We don't buy that the Russians are evil and the Europeans and the Ukrainians are good. Everyone like to see it stop. And that's partly because we know this game. We've been played this game before. And so I think that is important to understand. And I wrote a piece within 6 months of the war, mentioning censorship as well. People like me also, public enemy #1 on the main platforms. I didn't used to be, but now I can't get invited on some of the channels. In Asia, I am. I used to write for some of the leading international publications. No more, because the moment you put a more balanced account. But I got someone from the Nikkei to say, editor, I'm tired of this bias. I know, Chandran, you will have a different view. Can you write something? So anyone's interested, they go and take it. And from this part of the world, the view is simply this, that wars are evil when the victims are white. And wars are okay and justified if the victims are brown, and we can call it undemocratic states, which we're trying to civilize, And that article went viral once it was posted, because it basically called out what many of us think: all wars are bad. No one should get killed. Aggression by a larger state on a smaller state is not good, whatever the provocation. But we live in a world of geopolitics. Provocation leads to terrible outcomes. But the reaction in Europe was so strong, yet nobody had the same reactions at the Iraq War to stop it. CNN and BBC didn't, Libya, and all of these things, not to mention the other stuff that's going on. And look at the coverage on Gaza. And I wrote that piece, and it's, I think, a European reaction to it's our continent, and unwittingly, certain Western reporters had said, these people are down, they're just like us, blonde, white people, betraying a deep racist attitude, because if they're brown, Arabs, etc., or black, who cares? And that's something that I think we see as deeply racist, underlying much of this kind of view. But no one wants war.
Yeah, no, I completely agree. I mean, these were shocking statements made on BBC and so on by reporters who were just speaking from their hearts. So that they actually meant it. That's just the way they thought.
They betray their country.
I must say though, the ability of Europeans and in general, like whites, to be racist is even higher than that, because we manage to outrace certain whites. The Switzerland's biggest racist problem in the past, and even still now, I would argue, is towards Serbs, Croats, Bosniaks from the former Yugoslavia. And I once showed a picture of my best friends who are Croats and Serbs to my Taiwanese friend, and then he looked at me and said, "What? But Pascal, they're white." It's like, yeah, we manage to be racist even to fellow whites if we find the right reason. But in this sense, this war-making capacity always goes hand in hand with strategically deploying racism. Also the way that when the Jews were genocided by the Germans, they all depicted them as this kind of very outlandish figures, right? And this actually continues now with the Russians and so on. So this whole masquerade of this liberal era of having overcome racism, of being inclusive and so on, it's all for nothing. It's all a big make believe in order to sell the story that everything's better now.
Remember, multicultural, we inclusive, and all of that. Again, there's an industry, but can I just add one point here that also for your viewers, right? Racism exists all over the world, right? We should acknowledge that. And there are many reasons for that. It's part of the failings of the human condition. I think some parts of the world would improve. So there's racism in India. And whenever I talk about this, Westerners and say, oh, there's racism here. Absolutely true. The only difference is very few nations, big or small, and I don't call it the global south, we can have a different word for it because I think it's a patronizing term coined, and I've written about this. I'll send you the article about it. But the difference is that no other nations have gone about large-scale, persistent, and with extreme violence to inflict harm on others based on their race and diminishing them as human beings as the Europeans have around the world. And then it became part of the deep-rooted way of thinking, and then it became part of almost a psychological way. So I want to be clear, racism exists in India, Indonesia, parts of Africa, but none of them have inflicted harm on others on this scale. Some may argue, well, they don't have the power to inflict harm. Well, good. At least we have that as a protection, right? So the argument that I've heard is that, and even from elite Asians, well, if the Chinese had more power, they'd go and bomb Japan. I said, I don't think so. I don't think so. So this is a discussion to be had to first to acknowledge that racism is sadly, in different parts of the world, part of the human condition. But in terms of the structural issues and the militarization of this view that we can therefore inflict harm on others because we see them as inferior people because of their race and religion, that is what the West has done, and history was recorded it over the last 300 years. There are other parts of the world where this sort of racism has resulted in clashes, but not on this scale. So I just want to make that also very clear.
That's
And this is what something that the Europeans, coming back to earlier conversation, and Americans refuse to acknowledge. They refuse to see the persistent nature of this sort of things. And for the rest of the world, it's resurfaced in Gaza.
yeah. These are very, very good and valuable points. Like however, what in your view is the best prism through which to understand what's going on? So just as an example, like yesterday I was in a webinar I hosted a webinar with Radhika Desai and Jeffrey Sachs, and they made the point, both of them, that the realist school of international relations is basically very apologetic towards these crimes, because they basically say, look, this is how we Europeans behave, that's how every human behaves, therefore it's rational that this kind of violence happens, right? And I don't want to ascribe to great analysts like John Mearsheimer and so on, that they want to do that, but the exercise of framing stuff in such a way then kind of camouflages other elements, like what you said, like the impact of racism on the development of how these nations interact now. What in your way is the most clarifying lens through which to analyze the global system?
In terms of, you mean racism, or
In terms of power dynamics, or of structural changes?
well, the structural change that we are struggling with at the moment is the dismantling, as I call it, of the old system, which was partially dismantled through the act of decolonization, which was not granted to people, but was essentially taken because of the wars of resistance, right? Well, that accelerated after the Second World War and culminated in the the independence of many countries in Asia, the Middle East, and Africa in the 60s, and even to the 70s, right? So that started to happen, and we know still exists. It existed in Africa, in apartheid South Africa in the 90s. I lived in Hong Kong for a long time. Colonization was the rule from the 70s. And so the prism that I give you, and rather than look at Africa, etc., just look at Hong Kong of the deconstruction. So 1997 till 1997, not 87, Hong Kong was a British colony. And as soon as, and then it went back to the sovereign, which is China. And 25 years after that, the Brits, the Americans, and the West are still so uncomfortable with this notion that, particularly the Brits and the American allies, the sort of Anglo-Saxon arrogance, that there's only we could make this place one of the world's greatest financial centers of the world, right? And now that bitterness has resulted in massive campaigns, Wall Street Journal, etc., to demonize Hong Kong. And in 2019, we had riots, disenfranchised youth, etc. But the playbook is very clear. It was foreign interference. And I am a resident of Hong Kong. I'm not Chinese. I saw it very clearly that this was lots of infiltration. During the heights of the riots, I saw burly white men in many corners of the city orchestrating the youth, etc. I'm not saying that the youth didn't have grievances. I support much of their grievances in terms of economic conditions, etc. But the grievances of Hong Kong, which were exploited, were not created by the Chinese Communist Party. It was actually created by a British colonial system, which created an extractive economy around land, which a few, essentially, including the crown, benefited from enormously. And so the youth essentially rebelled against that harsh economic realities. But that was morphed into that they don't have freedom. And I've argued that way to dismantle that colonial land supply thing, which has created essentially disenfranchisement, is for the Chinese Communist Party to get involved and put forward a more egalitarian, non-market-based policies that would enfranchise the land policies, which is what Singapore did under Lee Kuan Yew. So that's one lens of looking through it that I see. It's dismantling old systems of market capitalism, etc., free markets, access to resources, etc. And the whole thing about, geopolitics, as I started to say, is who controls the pathways in terms of resource extraction, market access, and the financialization of the world. If an alternative system begins to appear, then it starts to essentially take away the privileges of the post-colonial era where, after the troops had left, you were forced to leave. It was supplanted by institutions, the IMF and all of that, the WTO, which still dominated the ability of what globalization looks like. So another way to look at this lens is all this talk about there's deglobalization. This is very shallow thinking. There's no such thing as deglobalization. There is changing the rules of what was termed globalization, which was the rules should disproportionately benefit us. That was seen as the norm. We write the rules, you guys will come to the table. You might not understand these complex legal documents because you don't have the institutions, but please sign up. And if you're weak, you do sign up. But if you're stronger, China, India, you don't sign up. I mean, China, India, most people forget, was probably the country that stood up the most against the Doha agreements and the tariffs and the GATT, etc., because it didn't want its streets to look like, full of Tesco's and things, because it still had the view that the local shops, etc., and the marketplace should be dominated by, and a place for economic growth for locals. So you can look at this in many different ways, and I would say that globalization is just being redefined, and the others are having their say. You can call it whatever you want, but as soon as a Chinese person goes and trades in India, that's globalization. We don't need any rules for those. Of course, we want to make sure that people don't exploit each other, and that's why we do have certain ways of looking at these things in terms of the tariffs, etc. But there is no deglobalization. The deglobalization is the concept of fear instilled in those who essentially wrote the rules, who can't come to terms now with the new world order in which people are writing the rules and saying there are other ways of doing things, trading and co-prosperity. So that's how I would see it, and that's the real tension that they're facing. And I've spoken a fair bit about the tariffs are essentially, again, a favor that the US president has done by waking the world up to that old system doesn't work. And he's reacting because that system is fraying as other countries look to do different things. And that globalization that they were so much wanted, the economic powers in the USA said, we don't make phones anymore. We make it in China. And so it had implications for American industry. And that is of concern to the Americans, of course, and it should be. But don't punish the others because your elites made a lot of money out of this. Now, don't punish us. Now, let's find a way to bring industry to the USA. But you can't put me, hold a gun to my head and say, make all your phones in China, in the USA. That's not how it works, because that's the system you created. Now you figure it out differently. And the Americans think you can bully the rest of the world to restructure their economy. Well, the rest of the world is not going to blink.
Nope, very well put. And actually, I think at some point, even the United States will start to understand this, because what happened last week, for the first time, the Chinese actually enacting domestic export licensing requirements, which will impact the ability of the MIC, of the military industrial complex in the United States, to produce these implements of war. This will have an impact, and they don't like it. That's why they're so mad and so angry. But they can't change it. They cannot.
If they wanted to invest, and I read something that they would have to invest billions of dollars to create an alternative supply system.
But it will
But
take 10 years.
exactly. It'll take a long time and it will impede. So what's the reaction? Another knee-jerk reaction to say, we're going to hold a gun to your head with 100% tariffs. You think the Chinese are going to blink? When are you going to learn? The Indians are not going to blink. And the other thing I think the Americans and particularly Europeans don't understand is you cannot bully anyone. Those days are over. You might have economic power and you can coerce a bit, but you are not going to intimidate and bully. And you see the Indian reaction. When push comes to shove, and I say this, if the Chinese find that they are, having to endure a year of pain, let's call it, because of the, and I don't think this is happening. You can see already the Chinese economy has reduced the percentage of exports to the United States down to 10% or something. Look at different data. They're not reliant on the United States, but let's just assume for some reason the United States and Europeans bully many nations because China has diversified its exports to different countries. The Chinese will just say to the people, 1.3 billion, okay, everyone, tough times for the next 2 years. Everybody, tighten up. And what do the Chinese do? They tighten up. It's a civilization. It's a society that understands. And tightening up for them is part of that resilience that's built in. Because chaos, situation is in the living memory of many Chinese. Americans don't understand that. They understand conquest and abundance, and we dominate. And if America suffers pain, which it is suffering, a low intense civil war is emerging, which is unfortunate. Nobody wants to see America go down and get into more. But many Americans are suffering. But Americans have to endure more pain, which is already happening. The first response of the administration, and not just the current administration, is to punish the rest of the world, to redress the cause of that pain, because it's others who are writing the rules and beginning to take care of their destiny. So tongue in cheek, I say, the Chinese will tighten their belts, but try telling America and maybe eat one bowl of rice, less per day, rather than indulge. But the Americans will not be told you have to have one less Coke and a burger a day, because then the gums will come out, which is kind of what, in a crude way, is the analogy I'm using to describe the inability to accept a new world order and change internally, because that world order is not going to wait for you unless you think you're so special and you don't need to change. I think it was Ronald Reagan who said in response to President Carter 40 years ago, when Carter said we cannot continue to indulge and consume. Carter was the first president who said that, because it's all about consumption. Geopolitics and resources. If I control everything, then my people can all eat cheap stuff, leaving aside that, and abundant stuff, leaving aside the health impacts and all of that, which we know. But the economy apparently grows, but the consequences are severe. And I think Ronald Reagan says this: we don't negotiate in the American way of life. Well, they're having to negotiate now. And that'll be very painful. The problem is pain inside American politics at the moment results in the knee-jerk response to inflict pain on the rest of the world in economic and military interventions.
Yeah, this is why I think one of the main jobs is to figure out how to also take the United States by the hand and tell them, no, it's going to be fine. We can prosper together. You will not have to tighten. We will be fine. Leave the guns where they are. But, well, that's a discussion for another time. Chandran, people who want to find your writings, where's the best place to go to find you?
Oh, thank you. I think the best place, if you want to see some of the interviews I've done, etc., you can just go to YouTube and Google my name. I did an interview with the Chinese commentator Zhang Weiwei that has a lot of views, got a lot of views. But you can go to YouTube, and for my writings, just go to the Global Institute for Tomorrow's website, www.gift-inst.com. But the GIFT web.
I'll put the link to your website into the description of this video below. Everybody, please check out the analysis of Chandran. Mr. Nair, Chandran, thank you very much for your time today.
Yes, can I just say, if you allow me 30 seconds, I've got a new book coming out, which I think people would be very interested, and it's called Understanding China. And it's a book written originally with the Club of Rome as a report of the Club of Rome. But given how much interest there was, the academic publisher Routledge took on the publishing of the book. It's out in November, and that too, pre-orders can be found on the website. I just say that the book is called Understanding China, and it's not about criticizing or praising China. Most books on China either say China is great, and then the others just criticize it. This book essentially does not do either. It says, this is China, you figure it out, and gives you a lot of data, and is written in a simple way so that the average reader, so it's not an academic tone, can understand, and they can come to their own conclusions.
You know what we do in November once it's out? Write me again. We do either another talk or a panel together with one or two more colleagues in order to discuss China, because this is a pivotal topic. So pivotal. Chandran Nair, thank you very much for your time today.
Thank you for having me. Enjoyed it. Thanks so much. Take care of yourself. Bye-bye.